Number 16. Botox nurse scam. Paulette Padilla, a 31-year-old nurse practitioner specializing in Botox and filler injections at the New You Wellness Center in Coral Gables, South Florida, was apprehended in 2021 for her alleged involvement in a phone scam targeting elderly individuals. The scam reportedly deceived seniors into wiring or mailing substantial amounts of money, with at least 2 victims losing over $40,000. Padilla faces charges of organized scheme to defraud, trafficking cannabis, and possession of substances with the intent to traffic. The arrest unfolded when an 86-year-old woman from Chicago wired $20,000 after receiving a call falsely claiming that a family member had been in a traffic accident. A subsequent investigation by Bank of America, prompted by the victim's family, revealed that the money had been transferred to Padilla's bank account. Padilla, upon inquiry by a bank investigator, asserted that the elderly woman was a friend who sent the funds as payment for a Super Bowl party she was organizing. Further scrutiny exposed financial transactions involving Padilla sending substantial sums to her mother and an associate, alongside ATM withdrawals. A phone link to Padilla also revealed evidence of another victim, an elderly woman from New York, who'd sent $22,000 in cash to Padilla and her alleged accomplices after being falsely informed of a family member's accident. And in addition to the fraud charges, Padilla faced law enforcement action on different fronts. Agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives raided Padilla's Southwest Miami-Dade apartment, seizing 170 pounds of marijuana. But despite the serious charges, Padilla was released from jail upon posting a $7,500 bond, with a scheduled court appearance on May 13, 2021. Padilla, described as a board-certified nurse practitioner with a background in aesthetics and anti-aging medicine, gained recognition for her gentle touch and precision in Botox and fillers, as detailed in her clinic biography. But with the evidence of her crimes piling up, it's unlikely that she'll remain a free woman for long. Unfortunately, there's been no recent updates on this case, so it's unclear whether or not Padilla is learning her lesson from the inside of a jail cell. Number 15. Danielle Tolbert. On March 3, 2021, police officers in Bedford, Massachusetts began investigating a reported incident of a domestic battery on a child who was under the age of 14 at the time. The investigation eventually led them to the home of 29-year-old Bradley Livingston and 28-year-old Danielle Tolbert, who had multiple children together, although it's unclear how many. The responding officers could tell, after speaking with the couple's children, that they had been coached on what to say to the authorities when questioned about the incident. According to the police, Tolbert told her kids to lie to the officers about what had really happened, and they were also instructed to tell the same lies during their one-on-one interviews with representatives from the Department of Child Services. And while it's unclear what role Tolbert's boyfriend, Bradley Livingston, played in the scheme, he was arrested along with Tolbert on charges of obstruction of justice and for assisting a criminal. Tolbert allegedly told her children not to tell anyone about the events that transpired, prompting an investigation by the authorities to get to the bottom of things. According to police reports, Tolbert made excuses to her kids to get them to lie, telling them that what happened should stay between their family because, in her own words, it was a family matter and didn't concern anybody else. During her own interrogation, Tolbert claimed that the alleged incidents never happened and that she never told her kids to lie to investigators or the police. Unfortunately, though, the outcome of this case is unclear. Number 14. Satya Thakur. Satya Thakur, a 35-year-old individual who'd previously failed medical school, resorted to violence, attempting to stab his family to death after years of maintaining a web of lies. Thakur's deception began when he failed university exams, prompting him to pose as a doctor, while in reality, he was spending his days at the library. The pressure of sustaining his falsehoods eventually reached a breaking point in May of 2019, just before a promised family vacation to the United States. In a disturbing turn of events at his mother-in-law's home in Berkshire, England, Thakur sought to smother and stab the woman, Geeta Laxman, who was supposed to accompany the family on the impending trip. However, he was caught in the act by his wife, Nisha, so Thakur also attacked her, along with his brother-in-law, Primal Laxman, and sister-in-law, Rashika Laxman. Police then arrived on the scene to find Thakur stabbing himself while locked in a bathroom, shouting about demons. Initially sectioned under the Mental Health Act, Thakur was found to have fabricated hallucinations of demons, revealing the extent of his deceit, and as a result he was sentenced to 28 years in prison and received a restraining order against his family indefinitely. Thakur's history of falsehood spanned 7 years, including lies about his occupation, a staged car accident on his wedding day to avoid honeymoon expenses, and a continuous pretense of being a doctor. He pretended to work night shift and even stayed out overnight to keep up the ruse. When the family planned a dream holiday to Los Angeles, California, Thakur's failure to book flights and tickets led to the violent outburst. The prosecution emphasized Thakur's attempt to buy time and escape the consequences of his impending exposure. His violent actions targeted his mother-in-law initially, but escalated to include other family members as well. Thakur's mental health claims, including hallucinations of demons, were later revealed to be part of his elaborate lies. The judge characterized Thakur's actions as madness and an idiotic decision, highlighting that his extreme violence was a desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his long-standing deception. In the end, though, Thakur's failure to confront his academic setbacks and the ensuing violent act resulted in severe legal consequences. Number 13. Lorri Eisenberg. Lorri Eisenberg, a 66-year-old woman from Idaho, initially claimed that her husband, Larry Eisenberg, died in 2018 after falling from their boat into Lake Coeur d'Alene. However, she faced murder charges when his autopsy revealed a lethal dose of Benadryl in his system at the time of his death. Larry disappeared on February 13, 2018, with Lorri asserting that he fell into the lake while fixing a broken motor. She claimed to have tried to save him, but she allegedly tripped on a space heater, hitting her head, making her unable to do so. She said that when she regained her strength, she circled the lake for an hour before calling 911. However, Larry's autopsy contradicted her account, revealing no signs of drowning, but a lethal amount of Benadryl. Court documents suggest that Lorri intentionally created the situation leading to Larry's death. Charges include the possibility of poisoning, torture, and lying in wait. Lorri was previously the executive director of an organization aiding low-income families, but in January 2019, she pleaded guilty to wire fraud and federal program theft, stealing $500,000 from her employer. She received a 5-year prison sentence and a $1.7 million civil judgment as a result. Lorri's daughters also pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud related to embezzled funds, although it was later revealed that they had no idea the funds were stolen, while Lorri also faced a murder charge for poisoning her husband. In an update from 2021, Lorri Eisenberg was sentenced to 30 years to life in prison for the second-degree murder of her husband, Larry Eisenberg. Larry's body was found in Lake Coeur d'Alene, with the autopsy revealing diphenhydramine toxicity from Benadryl, a drug known to cause drowsiness. Lorri's sentencing includes details of her elaborate lies and the intent behind Larry's death, including her embezzlement scheme and a plan to drown herself. The judge emphasized the gravity of her actions and the lack of credibility in her statements during the hearing. Number 12. Cathy Forom. In 2002, Cathy Forom, a notorious perjurer in Ottawa, Canada, was sentenced to 6 months in jail for uttering death threats against a former lover. Known for a history of making false accusations of assault, Forom cried during sentencing, though Justice Rommel Mass deemed her a manipulative person and a danger to society. He also expressed skepticism about her claimed illnesses, including skin cancer, a brain tumor, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The victim, Stephen Brown, faced severe consequences due to Forom's actions, losing access to his children, his house, and even his job. Forom's masterful manipulation led to her using the police and courts as weapons, making it challenging for authorities to identify her deceptive practices. Another victim, Jamie Nelson, endured 3 separate jail terms based on fabricated charges by Forom, including assault and stalking. Nelson spent 18 months in solitary confinement for refusing counseling, resulting in his son being taken by the Children's Aid Society, and eventually the boy was put up for adoption. Despite the satisfaction of seeing Forom sentenced, victims like Nelson believe that the police and prosecutors share responsibility for the damage caused. Fordom's influence on the justice system extended to the point where she secured funding to establish a halfway house for rehabilitating offenders. Forom still faces a civil suit brought by Nelson, shedding light on the enduring legal consequences of her actions. The victims, while relieved to see Forom held accountable, emphasized the need for the justice system to address the challenges posed by manipulative individuals like her. Number 11. Gene Morrison. A 48-year-old conman from Hyde, Cheshire named Gene Morrison was sentenced to 5 years behind bars in 2007 for a fraudulent career spanning almost 3 decades. Posing as a forensic expert, Morrison deceived victims in around 700 cases, manipulating trials involving armed robbery, death by dangerous driving, unexplained death, drug offenses, and cases of questioned paternity. Despite leaving school without qualifications, Morrison successfully fooled judges, barristers, solicitors, and their clients into believing that he was a qualified forensic expert. His unorthodox and unprofessional methods involved utilizing legitimate experts and then overcharging clients. In one case, he falsely claimed that a young man's unexplained death was self-inflicted, charging the grieving parents £16,500 for work they never commissioned. Described as an inveterate and compulsive liar by the trial judge, Morrison's actions were deemed detrimental to the legal process. Judge Jeffrey Lewis emphasized Morrison's lack of expertise, dishonesty, and disregard for the consequences of his actions on the administration of justice. Greater Manchester Police built their case against Morrison on 9 serious instances where he posed as a forensic investigator, and following the trial, police initiated a re-examination of 700 cases connected to Morrison, with identified miscarriages of justice slated for review by the Attorney General. During the trial in Minshall Street Crown Court in Manchester, Morrison, who was born in Jamaica, was convicted of 22 offences between 2002 and 2005, including obtaining a money transfer by deception, obtaining property by deception, perverting the course of justice, and perjury. In the end, though, he was acquitted of 1 count of obtaining a money transfer by deception. Detective Superintendent Martin Bottomley labelled Morrison a Walter Mitty character, explaining that his life was built on lies and deceit. Morrison's fraudulent actions, which targeted innocent victims, including grieving families, drew criticism from those directly affected. One victim, Barry Power, expressed relief at Morrison being held accountable, acknowledging the additional distress he caused during a difficult time for his family and others. Number 10. Guo Jang. Ohio-based rheumatology professor and researcher Guo Jang has been sentenced to 37 months in prison for making false statements to federal authorities as part of an immunology research fraud scheme. 58-year-old Jang was also ordered to pay over $3.4 million in restitution to the National Institute of Health and approximately $413,000 to the Ohio State University. Jang, a resident of Hilliard, Ohio, was arrested in May of 2020 in Anchorage, Alaska, attempting to board a charter flight to China. He carried bags containing laptops, cell phones, USB drives, expired Chinese passports, and deeds for Chinese property. Jang pleaded guilty in November, admitting that he lied on applications to secure about $4.1 million in NIH grants to advance China's expertise in rheumatology and immunology. The sentencing is part of an effort to address concerns related to the Chinese government's 1,000 Talents program, which aims to hold individuals accountable for concealing affiliations and manipulating U.S. research funding agencies. Jang concealed his participation in Chinese talent recruitment programs, receiving federal research dollars while hindering critical medical research advancements. Jang's failure to disclose affiliations and foreign commitments damaged trust in U.S. research and violated transparency values in academia. The sentencing serves as a deterrent, emphasizing the FBI's commitment to investigating individuals undermining cutting-edge work at U.S. universities. The case underscores the importance of reporting conflicts of interest when seeking NIH grant funding and preventing the misuse of taxpayer dollars. Jang, a professor of internal medicine leading autoimmune research at The Ohio State University and Pennsylvania State University, made false statements on NIH grant applications, concealing his participation in Chinese talent plans and collaboration with a Chinese university controlled by the government. Participating in the Chinese talent plan since 2013, Jang used US-conducted research to benefit the People's Republic of China. The failure to disclose foreign commitments to employers and the NIH was a breach of trust. But Zhang's sentencing aims to discourage involvement in China's talent recruitment plans, safeguarding American innovations and technology. Acknowledging the assistance of the Anchorage FBI Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Alaska, this case was investigated by the FBI and the Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General. The sentencing reflects a commitment to transparency, trust, and deterring fraudulent access to research funds. Number 9. Maria McBurnie. Maria F. McBurnie, a 62-year-old Toms River resident in New Jersey, was arrested in July of 2023 after being exposed for posing as a doctor, treating patients, and prescribing medications without a valid license. Also known as Marife L. McBurnie, she faces charges including practicing medicine without a license, forgery, healthcare fraud, and distributing a controlled dangerous substance. Prosecutors allege that McBurnie assumed the identity of a relative with a valid medical license, using the relative's name from March 2022 to June 2023. And during this period, McBurnie issued multiple prescriptions under the relative's name, submitted insurance claims, and billed patients for medical services, even when the actual relative was unable to see and treat patients. The Ocean County Prosecutor's Office didn't specify the medications McBurnie allegedly prescribed, but she was arrested on a Wednesday and was booked into an Ocean County Department of Corrections facility. Unfortunately, though, it remains unclear if she's been released, and information about her legal counsel doesn't seem to be available. The prosecutor's office urged individuals who were treated by McBurnie to come forward. Patients of the Toms River office, where McBurnie allegedly practiced, were advised in an automated phone greeting to email the facility for their medical records. Authorities from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Economic Crimes Unit of the prosecutor's office, and the Toms River Township Police Department collaborated in the investigation. Shaw Medical Associates, where McBurnie purportedly treated patients, now has an automated voice message stating that the office is permanently closed and directs patients to request medical records via email. CNN reached out for comments from Shaw Medical Associates, but there's no indication of their response. McBurnie awaits a detention hearing, but it's currently unknown if she's retained legal representation. Number 8. Nicole Humes. In Dripping Springs, Texas, Nicole Humes, formerly associated with the Dorothy Butler law firm, was arrested and charged with falsely presenting herself as a licensed attorney in Texas following allegations of misrepresentation in November 2022. Humes, who'd worked as a paralegal for the firm, faced charges of pretending to be an attorney based on the investigation's findings. The law firm's owner, Dorothy Lawrence, asserted her unawareness of any wrongdoing, stating that she knew Humes wasn't licensed in Texas, but highlighted the woman's legal background, having a Juris Doctor degree and over a decade of legal practice under her belt. Lawrence clarified that Humes, who graduated from law school, practiced law in Pennsylvania and Illinois, having applied for reciprocity in Texas while awaiting approval. However, Pennsylvania state records indicate that Humes' license status is on administrative suspension, and a search on the Illinois State Bar Association website yields no results for her name. But according to Lawrence, Humes never misrepresented her licensing status in Texas and didn't engage in unauthorized legal work as per her knowledge. Despite Lawrence's claims, though, the firm terminated Humes's employment at the end of the previous year after the allegations surfaced. An arrest affidavit revealed that Humes was listed as a senior associate attorney on the firm's website and presented herself as a co-lead attorney on a case, a claim she attributed to Lawrence's instructions. Lawrence denied instructing Humes to do so, asserting that Humes was never asked or encouraged to act as co-counsel due to legal restrictions. The firm's reputation came under scrutiny when a former client, Colton Bures, filed a complaint with the state's Bar Association, expressing dissatisfaction with the firm's business practices. Lawrence defended the firm's reputation, highlighting its accolades and top rankings in the local legal community. Humes did pass the bar in July 2022, according to the Texas Board of Law Examiners website. However, she's not listed as a licensed attorney on the state's bar website, indicating that there might be additional prerequisites pending before she can officially practice law in Texas. Number 7. Christian Katan Mansur. In April 2023, 18-year-old Christian Katan Mansur of Macomb Township, Michigan, was arrested for impersonating a police officer. The Oakland County Sheriff's Office reported that Mansur, driving a BMW, attempted to pull over an off-duty Waterford Township police officer. He used red and blue lights attached to his car to gain the officer's attention at around 11 p.m. in Rochester Hills, a suburb north of Detroit. The off-duty officer, realizing the impersonation, followed Mansur to confront him, and during the confrontation, she identified herself as a police officer and requested Mansur's identification as well. Mansur claimed to be a Detroit police officer from the 12th Precinct, stating that he needed to retrieve his identification from his car. However, when he returned to his vehicle, he just drove away. The off-duty officer pursued Mansur to a trailer park that was approximately 8 miles away, but eventually she lost sight of the BMW. Subsequently, deputies observed Mansur changing license plates between 2 vehicles he owned. And after a brief foot chase, Mansur was arrested. Oakland County Sheriff Michael Bouchard emphasized the severity of the crime, stating that individuals pretending to be police officers pose a threat to the public and undermine legitimate law enforcement. He also urged anyone with similar experiences involving Mansur or his described automobile to contact the sheriff's office. Mansur was arraigned on a misdemeanor charge of impersonating a public officer and was released on $5,000 bond. Mansur couldn't be reached for comment, though, and it was unclear if he had retained legal representation. Number 6. Heidi Schmutz. In August 2019, a Pasco County Uber Eats driver named Heidi Schmutz claimed that she was held against her will and threatened with a gun by a man who got into her car without consent. She further stated that the man took her phone, preventing her from calling for help. However, an investigation by deputies revealed that Schmutz's account was false. Surveillance footage from the Denny's where the incident allegedly occurred and the hotel where she claimed to have escaped didn't support her claims, and deputies ultimately concluded that Schmutz wasn't in any apparent danger during the interactions with the man in her vehicle. Upon questioning, Schmutz admitted to providing false information. She disclosed that she willingly agreed to drive the man for cash payment, but when he couldn't provide the agreed-upon amount, she falsely reported the incident, exaggerating the events to make them seem more credible. As a result, Schmutz was arrested and charged with giving false information to law enforcement. But the Pasco Sheriff's Office clarified that the man involved wouldn't be eligible for an administrative expunction of false imprisonment charges. This decision was based on the fact that the department had acted in good faith with the evidence available at the time. The fate of the false imprisonment charges would be determined by the state attorney's office, but it's unclear if the charges were ever expunged. Number 5. Staged hate crime. In Chicago in 2022, actor Jussie Smollett received a 150-day jail sentence from Judge James Lynn for orchestrating a hate crime against himself. Following a more than 3-year legal saga, Smollett, who'd claimed to be a victim of a racist and homophobic attack, maintained his innocence during the hearing. But in the end, the judge sentenced him to 30 months of felony probation, including 150 days served in Cook County Jail. Lynn also ordered $120,106 in restitution to the city of Chicago, along with a $25,000 fine. Special prosecutor Dan Webb argued for an additional prison sentence, stating that Smollett's actions diminished hate crimes and discouraged real victims from reporting to law enforcement. Smollett's defense sought a limited sentence, focusing on community service, asserting that he'd already faced consequences in the criminal justice system, as well as damage to his career. During the hearing, Smollett proclaimed his innocence, raising concerns about potential harm to himself in jail. His attorney plans to appeal both the verdict and the sentence. Smollett faced 5 felony counts of disorderly conduct for lying to the police, and while he was acquitted on 1 count, the judge labeled him a narcissist and a permanently convicted felon. The sentencing has been subject to praise from Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who emphasized the message that false claims would not be tolerated. Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx criticized the prosecution's efforts as a relentless, organized, and effective push, suggesting that Smollett was convicted in a matter of months through a kangaroo prosecution. The case initially gained international attention when Smollett reported a hate crime against himself, but subsequent developments revealed his orchestration of the attack. Number 4. Joseph Franco. Joseph Franco, a former narcotics detective with 20 years of service in the New York Police Department, is currently on trial in 2023 for repeatedly lying about witnessing drug sales around Manhattan public housing. Prosecutors accuse Franco of violating the trust of fellow officers and causing 2 individuals to be wrongly imprisoned based on false evidence. He faces charges including 6 counts of perjury in the first degree, 5 counts of official misconduct, and 15 counts of providing false documents or information to a public official or office. And in case you didn't know, a conviction for perjury in the first degree carries a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison. During the trial's opening statements in Manhattan Criminal Court, Assistant District Attorney Samantha Dworkin argued that Franco's actions weren't isolated mistakes, but were instead part of a pattern. The prosecution claims that Franco lied about witnessing drug sales, which were later disproven by video evidence. The lies came to light in April 2018 when a prosecutor reviewed surveillance footage related to one of Franco's cases, revealing inconsistencies in his account. Following Franco's arrest, prosecutors moved to dismiss more than 100 cases connected to him in Manhattan, and other boroughs took similar actions. The trial focuses on incidents dating as far back as February 2017, with internal investigations revealing inconsistencies in multiple cases. Dworkin asserted that Franco's lies deprived defendants of their due process rights and led to the dismissal of cases, and some individuals spent significant time in jail based on false claims. Franco's defense, led by attorney Howard Tanner, argued that Franco was an effective narcotics investigator operating in a challenging environment. Tanner described the investigative process as imprecise, claiming that Franco couldn't take notes or record real-time observations. He suggested that while Franco might have been wrong about specific details, it didn't necessarily constitute a crime. Tanner contended that video evidence alone was insufficient to prove Franco's alleged lies, and that his client's intent was to protect the community from drug-related violence. The trial involves a complex legal landscape where prosecutors aim to prove a pattern of false testimony by a former police officer, while the defense emphasizes the challenges of undercover narcotics work. For now, the outcome of the case is unclear, so we'll have to wait and see how things play out in the coming months. Number 3. Robert Earl Tucker Jr. Robert Earl Tucker Jr., a former teacher at Parkview Elementary in Baton Rouge, was at the center of controversy in 2022 after it was revealed that he lied on his job application by denying that he had any criminal convictions. Tucker, who applied for positions in the East Baton Rouge Parish School System 25 times before succeeding, had previously been convicted of multiple felonies in August of 2020. The charges stemmed from his attempts to obtain a gun by dishonestly concealing his mental health history. Tucker's hiring process involved a mandatory background check, which took 21 days instead of the usual 5 to 7. And during his short tenure at Parkview, parents raised concerns about his behavior, alleging that he talked to himself, accused a student of using a racial slur, and even refused to post grades. As suspicions grew, parents discovered news stories about Tucker's felony conviction from August 2020. The situation then escalated, leading to Tucker's resignation on September 29th of that same year, 8 days after the background check results were received. An uproar ensued after the revelation of Tucker's resignation, with parents demanding additional security at the school. The school district faced criticism for hiring Tucker without waiting for the background check results. At a private meeting on October 5th, school leaders apologized, but questions about whether Tucker was the felon mentioned in news stories remained unanswered. The documents obtained through public records requests reveal several inconsistencies in Tucker's employment history and qualifications. While claiming to have worked at the Greenville Superintendent's Academy for 11 months, records indicate only a 2-month tenure. Tucker applied for various positions over the years, including administrator roles, but succeeded in securing only one teaching position in 2017. Tucker, a U.S. Army veteran with a background in teaching, shares similarities in handwriting, signatures, and other life details with the felon Robert Earl Tucker. Both of them grew up in Bastrop, Louisiana. They attended the same high school and they have similar ages. However, the school district hasn't disclosed the nature of Tucker's criminal activity or details of his criminal background check. The controversy led to Superintendent Cito Narcisse discontinuing the practice of hiring employees before completing their background checks. The school board also considered policy changes, including the removal of language allowing conditional hiring before background checks are complete. Tucker's application and resume reveal discrepancies in his teaching experience, and questions have arisen about the verification process conducted by the district's human resources staff. But despite Tucker's claims of extensive teaching experience, there are gaps and contradictions in his employment history. Number 2. Andrea Sniderman. In 2013, a Georgia woman named Andrea Sniderman was sentenced to spend about 4 years in prison by a judge after being convicted of lying to police who were investigating the shooting death of her husband outside a preschool. The judge handed down a 5-year sentence, but granted credit for time served in custody and under house arrest. Prosecutors initially sought a 20-year sentence after Sniderman was convicted of perjury, making false statements, and other charges. Sniderman's former boss, Hemi Newman, was convicted of fatally shooting her husband, Rusty Sniderman, outside an Atlanta preschool. Initially charged with murder, prosecutors dropped those charges on the eve of jury selection, proceeding instead with other counts. Sniderman had pleaded for leniency, expressing regret for allowing Newman into her life, blaming him for her husband's death. Several friends testified in court, portraying Sniderman as a wonderful mother whose children needed her. Rusty Sniderman's brother, Stephen, however, called her a common criminal and a liar, stating that she shouldn't use her children as human shields to seek a lighter sentence. The judge ordered Sniderman to serve multiple 5-year sentences concurrently, and defense attorneys announced plans to appeal on various grounds. Despite calls for leniency, the judge emphasized that Sniderman had not taken responsibility for her actions during the trial. DeKalb County District Attorney Robert James said the system worked, noting that Sniderman didn't take responsibility or accountability for lying to police and the court. In the end, the jury found her guilty on 9 counts, including making false statements, hindering the apprehension of a criminal, concealment of material facts, and perjury. Throughout the trial, prosecutors maintained that Andrea Sniderman had a romantic relationship with Newman and repeatedly lied about it, hindering the investigation into her husband's death. Sniderman and her defense team denied the romantic involvement, asserting that the police mishandled the case by not focusing on Newman. Sniderman testified that she saw Newman as a mentor, regretting not informing her husband about his advances. And while acknowledging blurred lines of appropriate conduct, she denied any sexual relationship with Newman. The defense argued that prosecutors had a weak case and were just desperate to secure a conviction. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. Number 1. Shando Gray and Michael Ficara. 2 men, Shando Gray and Michael Ficara, were arrested in October of 2023 in New Jersey for allegedly impersonating police officers across multiple counties. The 48-year-old Gray from Lindenwold and 39-year-old Ficara from Mount Royal now face charges including second-degree robbery. Surveillance footage shows the suspects walking with what appear to be police-style badges around their necks. The duo, driving a red 4-door Ford sedan with a Pennsylvania license plate featuring an emergency light on the roof, was involved in several incidents. On September 19th, the suspects pulled over a victim in Gloucester Township at around 9 p.m. The men then identified themselves as police officers before stealing cash from the unsuspecting motorist. Another incident occurred on September 28th in Winslow Township at 5 a.m., where Gray and Ficara stopped a driver, claiming the person was a robbery suspect. But the suspects fled when the victim requested a marked police car. Later that same day, they attempted to stop a car near Coles Plaza in Washington Township, but the victims drove away. Gray and Ficara then allegedly robbed an unoccupied vehicle nearby, taking a wallet and credit cards from the new target. Hours later, before 11 p.m., Deptford Township Police received a report from a driver who was approached by Gray and Ficara at Almonacin Creek Park. And on September 30th, just before 10 p.m., Lindenwold Police responded to a call on East Elm Avenue, where two victims were approached by individuals posing as plainclothes officers. Gray and Ficara allegedly searched the victims and stole money, with one of the suspects displaying a small handgun. Shando Gray was arrested by the U.S. Marshals Service of New York, New Jersey Regional Fugitive Task Force, while Michael Ficara was taken into custody for unrelated accusations. Both men faced charges of second-degree robbery and additional offenses. Authorities revealed that the suspects wore police-style badges, drove a red sedan with an emergency light, and conducted fake traffic stops. For now, the investigation continues, so it's unclear if there are additional victims. Number 13. Jordan Graham. 8 days after their wedding in 2013, newlyweds Jordan Graham and Cody Johnson went on a hike together at Glacier National Park in Montana. 22-year-old Jordan returned from the hike alone, and when others began to notice that Cody was missing, she said he'd gone out with friends and that she hadn't heard from him since. However, investigators suspected the young woman of knowing more than she was saying, especially when Cody's boss reported him missing and Jordan never contacted the police at all. Once the investigation was underway, she claimed to receive an email from an anonymous person telling her not to bother looking for Cody because he'd fallen off a cliff at the park and was dead. Law enforcement searched the area the next day, and Jordan participated alongside other volunteers. And suspiciously, she just happened to be the one to discover his body at the base of a 200-foot cliff. As the evidence against Jordan continued to mount, interrogators dialed up the pressure during questioning. She eventually broke down and admitted that she'd pushed Cody off a cliff during their hike, and as a result, she was charged with murder. People were shocked, especially since the murder occurred during what was supposed to be one of the happiest times of a couple's lives. They couldn't imagine why a new bride would want to kill her husband, and they thought that Jordan and Cody seemed like a good match. Jordan was raised in a deeply religious household. Her faith was important to her, and she wanted a simple life, to get married and raise children as a stay-at-home mom. Cody shared this vision, and he was especially attracted to Jordan's wholesomeness. He loved that she was a churchgoer and had eagerly joined her congregation, where he fit right in with the parishioners. But at the couple's wedding, guests noticed that Jordan seemed unhappy, and by the next afternoon, she was reportedly telling her friends that she was already having second thoughts about the marriage. However, people chalked her behavior up to a typical case of cold feet, and they certainly never imagined she was capable of killing her groom. Jordan took a plea deal and admitted to second-degree murder in exchange for a 30-year sentence followed by 5 years of probation. And as part of the agreement, she was required to give a fully honest account of what happened. She said she killed Cody because she was terrified of intimacy due to her strict upbringing. So, instead of being honest with her new husband, who sounds like a pretty patient and understanding guy, she apparently decided that the best solution was to shove him to his death. Number 12. Margot Toni. Late one night in 2012, a New Jersey man accepted his ex-girlfriend's invitation to take a ride in her new car. 19-year-old Margot Toni picked her former flame up and drove to a local high school, where she suggested they get out of the car and take a walk. Two men then ambushed the ever-trusting ex and beat him with a baseball bat and a pipe. As Margot stood by and watched, it became clear to the victim that he'd been set up. The attackers stole the cash out of his wallet and smashed his cell phone, and the trio left the man bleeding on the ground as they got into Margot's car and fled the scene. Police arrested Margot several hours later. She went viral for flashing an ear-to-ear grin in her mugshot, but she probably wasn't smiling when she realized just how seriously authorities were taking the case. The next day, law enforcement caught up with Margot's boyfriend at the time, 20-year-old Danielle Tolbert, who initially denied having any involvement in the crime. A third co-conspirator, 27-year-old Samer Saleh, was also arrested. Margot Toni was convicted of a conspiracy charge and was sentenced to a year in county jail, while Danielle Tolbert received a 4-year prison sentence for theft by unlawful taking. And Samer Saleh, after being convicted of a conspiracy charge, was sentenced to 4 years behind bars. Number 11. Eric Bachelor. From the outside looking in, Eric Bachelor and his wife Peggy had it all. They were young, attractive, and successful. They drove flashy cars, owned a beautiful house along the Pacific coast, and had 3 healthy kids. But their all-American bliss was rudely interrupted during the summer of 1997 when a boat captain found Eric clinging to a boogie board off Southern California. Nearby, Eric's rented motorboat was running in circles at a high speed, and as he splashed around in the water, he could be heard yelling that his wife had fallen out of the boat. Peggy, however, was nowhere in sight. The boat captain rescued Eric while the Coast Guard responded to the scene, but despite their best efforts, Peggy was never found. Eric told law enforcement that he and Peggy rented the boat while celebrating their anniversary and Peggy's birthday, and on their way back to shore, Peggy drove the boat while Eric rode the boogie board. He claimed he hit a large wave and was pulled under, and that Peggy had vanished by the time he surfaced. Detectives noticed that Eric was calm on the way back to shore, then suddenly began acting hysterical in front of the waiting media circus. There were no actual tears streaming down his face, and he suddenly stopped crying when they were away from the cameras. The investigation was just beginning, and authorities already suspected foul play. 3 months after Peggy vanished, Eric met a beautiful, struggling model named Tina New. They began dating right away, and Tina moved in with Eric just days later. Eric's ability to move on so soon after his wife's disappearance raised major red flags for both law enforcement and Peggy's family. Detectives then approached Tina and urged her to call them if she came across any information about Peggy's accident. In the meantime, Eric's best friend Kobe Laker came forward with suspicions of his own after initially protecting his buddy during police questioning. Laker claimed that in the months leading up to Peggy's disappearance, Eric said he was sick and tired of her and that he couldn't take it anymore. During one particularly chilling conversation, Eric allegedly asked for Kobe's opinion of his idea to murder Peggy, put her body in a barrel, and dump it in the ocean. Kobe then agreed to wear a wire and confront Eric, but much to the frustration of the police, he stood by his story that it was a terrible accident. Detectives remained convinced that Eric killed Peggy, but knowing it and proving it are 2 different things. More than 2 years went by before Tina began noticing inconsistencies between Eric's story and news reports of Peggy's disappearance, and when she confronted him, his story also began to change. Tina later told Dateline's Josh Mankiewicz that after initially claiming that he was unable to help Peggy, Eric admitted that he could have helped her but didn't. Tina could tell he still wasn't being completely forthcoming, and she made it her personal mission to get the truth. Bits and pieces of it came out over time, adding up to one big, horrifying picture. According to Tina, Eric confessed to luring Peggy out for what she thought would be some quality time together on their anniversary. He allegedly brought weights onto the boat and used one of them to hit his wife in the back of the head, knocking her unconscious. Then he tied her up with rope, put her body in a trash bag, tied on some weights, and dropped Peggy in the water. 2 weeks later, Tina's neighbor overheard the couple arguing and called the police. She told them all about Eric's confession and agreed to wear a wire. Eric didn't confess on tape to the extent that police had hoped, but it was enough to finally charge him with murder. Prosecutors alleged that he was motivated by his unhappiness in the marriage and Peggy's $2 million life insurance policy. Eric's attorney argued that Tina's story about the confession was the product of a drug-fueled fantasy. The lawyer also tried to paint Tina out as an unreliable witness by bringing up her criminal history, but the jury found her credible despite her checkered past, and Eric Bachelor was convicted of first-degree murder, and now he's serving life behind bars without the possibility of parole. Number 10. Lorri Eisenberg. 68-year-old Lorri Eisenberg went missing during a morning boat ride with his wife on Idaho's Lake Coeur d'Alene in February 2018. Suspicion soon fell on his wife, Lorri Eisenberg, who told what seemed like a far-fetched story. It was odd in the first place for someone to go for a sunrise boat ride on Lake Coeur d'Alene during the wintertime, when temperatures are typically unpleasantly frigid. During the outing, Lorri called 911 and claimed that Larry fell overboard while leaning forward to inspect a broken boat propeller. She also said that she tripped and hit her head when she tried rushing over to help him. But after regaining her composure, she drove the boat around for at least an hour in search of her husband and then called police after finding no signs of him. However, her story would change several times throughout the ensuing investigation. A few weeks later, a separate investigation found evidence that Lorri had committed serious financial crimes. She was accused of embezzling nearly $580,000 during her time running a non-profit called the North Idaho Housing Coalition, which helps low-income people in need obtain housing. As the investigation into Larry's disappearance played out, Lorri was charged with 40 counts of forgery and 1 count of grand theft. Then, Larry's body was found a month after he disappeared. A toxicology report revealed that he had a lethal level of Benadryl in his system when he died, furthering investigators' suspicions of foul play. By then, Lorri had gone on the run and skipped 2 of her court dates for the fraud case. But she finally turned herself in more than 4 months later. In early 2019, she pleaded guilty to 4 fraud-related counts and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and authorities finally charged her with Larry's murder the following year. Prosecutors claimed that news of Lorri's financial crimes were about to hit the local press and that she knew Larry would likely divorce her if he found out about the allegations she was facing. It was no coincidence that Larry died on the day the article was published. In an email to the Housing Coalition shortly before the news broke, Lorri asked for time to grieve for Larry, but promised she'd repay the money she owed. Before their lives were suddenly rocked by not 1 but 2 major scandals within less than a month, Lorri and Larry's children thought their parents' marriage was more or less perfect. The only outward signs of anything being wrong revolved mainly around Larry's frustrations over his wife constantly forking money over to her adult daughters. Investigators suspect that this played a role in her decision to start stealing from the non-profit in 2016. Lorri entered an all-but plea to second-degree murder, which meant that she maintained her innocence but admitted that there was likely enough evidence for the prosecution to secure a conviction against her if the case were to go to trial. As a result, she was sentenced to life in prison with the eligibility for parole after 30 years. At her sentencing, Lorri claimed that she'd spiked her own drink with Benadryl because she planned on drinking it herself. She said that Larry helped himself to the beverage while she was asleep on the boat. Many, if not most people, don't seem to believe this version of events, but Lorri has never admitted to deliberately killing her husband. And whether she ever will remains to be seen. Number 9. Jason Harris. On a September evening in 2014, police officers responded to the Davison, Michigan home of 36-year-old mother of 2, Christina Ann Thompson Harris. A neighbor had stopped over to check on Christina at the request of her husband, 44-year-old Jason Harris, who was at work at the time. Jason said that Christina was still asleep when he left that day, and he wanted to make sure she was all right. But the neighbor immediately noticed that she was cold to the touch and dialed 911. By the time police arrived, it was far too late to save Christina. Jason left work and came home, where he told law enforcement that Christina had been battling a cold recently. A toxicology report found a lethal amount of heroin in her system, and authorities initially wrote the woman's death off as an accidental overdose. After all, everything pointed toward this being the case. Christina's family insisted that she wasn't a drug user. They were 100% sure of this, not only because it wasn't in her custom to use drugs, but because she had a baby who was breastfeeding. After all, her loved ones knew she'd never put her kids in danger, and they came up with a genius way to prove it. There were numerous packets of breast milk in the freezer. If Christina were a drug user, it would definitely show up on toxicology tests of the milk. But the milk tested completely clean of drugs, proving that Christina had, in fact, died under suspicious circumstances. Naturally, Jason Harris was the first person police looked at as a possible suspect in the case. They discovered that he stood to gain $120,000 from his deceased wife's life insurance policy. It may not sound like a lot, but people have killed for much less. Jason's brother told investigators that he'd made some concerning comments about wanting to get rid of Christina, while other people revealed that he was talking to multiple other women. 9 days after Christina's death, Jason bought a plane ticket to visit a woman in another state. And it wasn't long before his new girlfriend, or one of them at least, had moved in with him. He also allegedly confessed to co-workers that he'd killed his wife by pouring her a bowl of cereal and lacing it with heroin, and that he'd been lacing her food and drinks for weeks to knock her out. According to colleagues, he said that Christina dropped the bowl on the floor and collapsed while eating the cereal. It was no secret to Jason's work crew that he hated Christina. He trash-talked her constantly, and on more than one occasion he alluded to wanting her dead so he wouldn't have to pay the alimony or child support that would come with a divorce. In fact, he'd even allegedly offered a co-worker $10,000 to kill his wife, and another co-worker reportedly admitted to selling him Xanax, which was also used to drug Christina. Sadly, Christina seemed blissfully unaware of her husband's true feelings. Had she known, it might have motivated her to leave. In the end, a jury convicted Jason of first-degree murder, solicitation of murder, and delivery of a controlled substance causing death. He was sentenced to life in prison, which likely would have never happened if Christina's family hadn't fought so hard to ensure that justice was served. Number 8. Leslie Ann Galt. An Irish father of 3 named Paul Galt was brutally bludgeoned to death with a hockey stick inside his own home in the year 2000. Police accused his wife Leslie Ann Galt of masterminding the crime and having her secret lover, local fire chief Gordon Graham, carry it out. According to records, Graham lied in wait one morning at the couple's home in Northern Ireland, where the killer ambushed Paul out of nowhere, and as a result, Graham and Leslie were charged with murder. Prosecutors acknowledged that Leslie wasn't present at the scene when her husband was killed, but they accused her of providing Graham with the information he needed to carry the crime out successfully and of luring Paul to his death. On the day of the murder, Paul was under the impression that he and Leslie were going to spend the weekend away on a mini vacation. The last thing he was expecting was for a man who was carrying on an affair with his wife to appear without warning and beat him to death. Paul did know about the affair, though. He'd just recently found out about it, making the timing of his death even more suspicious. After first being convicted and sentenced to life, then tried 2 more times and ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, Leslie was freed from any accountability related to the crime. She said she felt morally responsible due to her affair, but fought a relentless battle in court to legally prove her innocence. Not everyone was happy about the outcome, but the justice system can't please everyone. The jury wavered a lot less when it came to deciding Graham's guilt, especially since there was DNA evidence connecting him to the crime scene. In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison and was paroled in 2021. In recent years, Leslie Galt and her current husband have dedicated themselves to their faith, and these days she's the leader of a Pentecostal church in the Republic of Ireland. Number 7. Hakan Isal. 32-year-old Semra Isal was both heavily pregnant and terrified of heights when her husband, 40-year-old Hakan Isal, decided to take her to a scenic overlook in southern Turkey in 2018. During the outing in what's known as Butterfly Valley, Hakan coaxed Semra to the edge of the cliff, saying that he wanted to take a selfie together. But instead of snapping a memorable photo, he shoved his 7 months pregnant wife over the edge, sending her plummeting 1,000 feet to her death. Just like anyone who shoves their partner off a ledge, Hakan attributed the tragedy to Semra losing her balance and falling. He then tried to collect on a $40,000 life insurance policy he took out in his wife's name shortly before he killed her, and financial records showed that he'd taken out 7 loans in Semra's name while she was still alive. Hakan denied murdering Semra. He claimed that he turned his back for just a few moments and suddenly heard Semra scream, and when he turned around, she was gone. Police didn't believe the story, and Hakan was charged with murder. During the court proceedings, witnesses testified about how Hakan was eerily calm as he sought help for Semra and his unborn baby. He didn't even bother joining a passing driver who went to go search for Semra's body after Hakan flagged him down. And in a chilling twist, another witness described how something about the couple's behavior toward each other prompted her and the person she was with to joke about which one might push the other off the cliff. And while nobody managed to record footage of Hakan pushing Semra off the edge, someone else who was at the park that day captured a video of Hakan trying to persuade his wife to come closer to the end of the cliff. In it, Hakan is acting overly pushy, to the point where he's practically dragging Semra over to the edge. During Hakan's trial, Semra's brother described seeing no emotion from his brother-in-law right after Semra's death, even as the family went to retrieve the slain woman's body from the medical examiner's office. Hakan was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. He appealed his conviction on the grounds of insanity, but the original ruling was upheld. Number 6. Lonnie Lauren Kakontes. After their marriage ended during the late 90s, attorney Lonnie Lauren Kakontes remained on cordial terms with his second wife and legal assistant, Miki Kanasaki. And when Kakontes filed for divorce from his third wife in 2005, he and Kanasaki became intimate again, but their rekindled romance was no fairy tale. Over the years, Kakontes and Kanasaki had argued bitterly over money and assets. Kakontes wanted to sell their house in California, but Kanasaki was adamantly against putting it up for sale. And while Kanasaki was financially savvy and trustworthy with money, Kakontes acted like she wasn't, and he oversaw her financial activity like a hawk. They nevertheless continued to carry on a complicated relationship that didn't exactly qualify as a committed situation, but functioned a lot like one in a day-to-day sense. In 2006, Kakontes booked Mediterranean cruise tickets for himself and Kanasaki. He told her it would be a chance for them to work on their relationship and maybe even officially get back together. In the weeks leading up to the cruise, Kakontes allegedly told his friend Bill Price that he was only carrying on a relationship with Kanasaki because he was afraid she'd go after her legally entitled share of his money and assets. He was more attracted to his third ex-wife and merely saw Kanasaki as an obligation. As a successful lawyer, Kakontes could have afforded a nice cruise, but the excursion they went on was a converted car ferry operated by a little-known company that catered almost exclusively to working-class European customers. He and Kanasaki were the only Americans on the ship, called the Island Escape, and even the travel agent who booked the trip for Kakontes thought his choice was extremely strange. On the third day of the voyage, Kakontes reported Kanasaki missing. He said they'd returned to their room at around midnight, and he went to bed. But 4 hours later, he woke up and realized his travel companion wasn't in the room. A scientific research ship discovered Kanasaki's body off the Italian coast the next day, and according to the medical examiner who performed her autopsy, she was strangled to death before she ever entered the water. This fact only furthered investigators' suspicions that she was murdered. Kakontes didn't even try to act emotional about his ex-wife's death, which seemed like a red flag among law enforcement. But he didn't seem too concerned about that either. He didn't even bother notifying his former in-laws of Kanasaki's death. When questioned by the FBI, Kakontes said that he thought Kanasaki got seasick and fell off their stateroom balcony while throwing up over the railing. A closer look at the ship's design showed that unlike most cruise ships, the lower decks didn't protrude out any further than the upper decks. In other words, if someone fell off a higher level balcony, there was little risk of them landing on any other decks on their way down. Prosecutors would later accuse Kakontes of choosing the ship for this reason, to ensure that his victim made it into the water. They also claimed that Kakontes likely didn't think Kanasaki's body would ever be found, and if it hadn't been, he might have gotten away with the murder. The investigation dragged on for years before Kakontes was finally charged in connection with the case in 2013, and in 2020, 14 years after Kanasaki's death, he was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in federal prison. Number 5. Harold Henthorn. In September 2012, 58-year-old Harold Henthorn and his wife, 50-year-old Toni Henthorn, celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary with a hike in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. But what began as a scenic sightseeing trip ended in tragedy when, surprise, surprise, Toni landed at the bottom of a 130-foot cliff. She'd stopped on top of the cliff to snap a photo and plunged face first to the ground below. Toni died from her injuries, and as Harold soon learned, law enforcement wasn't so quick to write it off as a tragic accident. He claimed that his wife had stumbled and fell, but the circumstances caused investigators to wonder if he'd pushed Toni. Harold had marked an X on a map at the very spot where she was standing when she suddenly went over the edge. Toni had undergone multiple knee surgeries, so police thought it was weird that the couple had hiked up that particular path, which was known to be challenging. And they didn't have to look hard for a motive. Harold stood to gain $4.7 million from Toni's life insurance policy. There were no other witnesses to the incident, so police would have to find other ways to either corroborate or disprove Harold's claims. During the investigation, detectives learned about a previous incident where a 20-foot beam had fallen on Toni at the couple's mountain cabin. And if she hadn't bent over to protect herself before being hit, she would have died. In hindsight, it appeared to be a failed first attempt by Harold to murder Toni. Investigators also discovered that Harold Henthorn's first wife, Sandra Lynn Henthorn, had also died under suspicious circumstances back in 1995, a few months after the couple's 12th wedding anniversary. In this case, Harold was also conveniently the only witness. He claimed that Sandra was changing a tire when the car slipped off a jack and crushed her to death. Authorities suspected foul play, but with no bystanders to challenge Harold's narrative and not enough concrete evidence to prosecute him, they weren't in a position to press criminal charges. According to some of Harold's friends, he researched the finances of 3 different women before deciding to pursue Toni as his second wife. She was a successful ophthalmologist who came from a family with oil wealth, which meant that she had the one thing her husband was after: money. A federal jury convicted Harold of Toni's murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He appealed his conviction multiple times, including as recently as 2022, and has been denied each time. And while he hasn't been tried for Sandra's death, it's widely believed that he murdered her as well. Number 4. Amanda Lee Cowan. When 47-year-old Derek Brian Cowan left a tumultuous and violent marriage to his wife Amanda Cowan in 2019, his family did their best to support him in hopes that it would prevent him from going back to her. As his sister would later put it, they were trying to extricate him from Amanda's grasp. However, Derek found it impossible to say no to Amanda when she called him one night and said she wanted to discuss the possibility of trying to make their marriage work. So he went to Amanda's apartment in Edmonton, Alberta, and was jumped by 3 men as soon as he walked in the door. The attackers duct-taped Derek to a chair, then repeatedly beat and stabbed him. At one point, he managed to escape and ran to a bathroom where he barricaded the door. But one of his assailants barged their way in and killed him with a machete. The group planned to stuff Derek's body into a large hockey bag, but they were busted by Amanda's roommate, who arrived home and witnessed the carnage that had just occurred. She called the police, and 4 suspects were promptly arrested. Amanda was initially charged with first-degree murder. She admitted to a reduced manslaughter charge and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. On top of receiving a light sentence to begin with, she was given a half-day of time served credit for each day she spent out on bail in the comfort of her own home. Her boyfriend at the time, Jacob Cook, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a 6-year prison sentence. The young man who inflicted the fatal damage to Derek's body was convicted of second-degree murder, and a 4th unnamed suspect was convicted of being an accessory after the fact. For Derek's loved ones, the outcome of the case was a far cry from justice. And while Amanda apologized to his family at her sentencing, she never explained why she felt the need to exact deadly revenge on her ex when she could have just moved on with her life. Number 3. Sandra Wignall. In what was later described as a crime of lust and greed, 48-year-old Sandra Wignall felt inconvenienced by the existence of her husband Robert after just 9 months of marriage. She was carrying on an affair with a convicted murderer named Terrence Bewley, who'd served a 10-year prison sentence for his first killing and wasn't afraid to do it again. One day in 1993, Sandra lured Robert into the woods behind their house in Surrey, England, under the guise of going to feed some wild foxes. Her unsuspecting hubby eagerly trailed behind her. Then, without warning, Sandra began putting some seriously X-rated moves on Robert, and of course, he didn't object. And right as he started getting into it, Terence Bewley and his friend Harold Moult rushed up and attacked him. They beat him and stabbed Robert to death before fleeing the scene. Perhaps the saddest aspect of the murder is the fact that Robert Wignall was known among many as an extremely friendly and harmless person who didn't have a single evil bone in his body. Sandra could have just left if she was unhappy, but instead, she chose to end her husband's life. Sandra told police that 3 teens had ambushed her and Robert in the forest. She even provided descriptions of the imaginary trio to a sketch artist, and police released the composite drawings in hopes of generating tips. At first, the public believed the story and reacted with widespread outrage over what people saw as a society plagued by the moral decay of a younger generation. Sandra maintained her innocence all throughout the case, even when investigators began to suspect her of being involved in the crime. Terence Bewley also denied any involvement, while Harold Moult initially refused the notion that he'd participated in the senseless killing. However, Moult eventually admitted to it after being charged with murder. The information Moult gave to detectives helped lead them to more evidence and provided valuable testimony that helped secure convictions against Sandra Wignall and Terence Bewley. All 3 defendants were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. During the case, prosecutors worried that Terence Bewley had been paroled way too early from his first life sentence for murder and that it had enabled him to kill again. But oddly enough, he was paroled yet again in 2012 after serving just 19 years, and today he continues to walk free. Number 2. Nathan Carman. In 2016, the crew of a commercial ship spotted a man adrift in the Atlantic on a lifeboat. 22-year-old Nathan Carman had spent 8 days floating helplessly after his boat sank off Rhode Island during a fishing trip, and sadly his mother, Linda Carman, died in the accident. The tragedy came 3 years after Nathan's grandfather, a wealthy Connecticut businessman named John Chikalos, was fatally shot. To investigators, the suspicious deaths in the family were no coincidence, and relatives felt the same way. After his grandfather's death, Nathan inherited around $500,000. He reportedly blew through the money over the next few years, while spending long periods of time unemployed. He was close to running out of cash when the boating accident that killed his mother occurred. Family members had always suspected Nathan of killing Chakalos, and when Linda was presumed lost at sea, they suspected him of also being responsible for her death. And they didn't have to look hard for a motive. As Linda Carman's sole heir, Nathan stood to gain around $7 million from her death. Despite the mounting suspicions against him, he continued to walk free until 2022, when authorities indicted him on a laundry list of federal charges relating to Linda Carman's death. He was charged with murder on the high seas and 7 fraud-related counts. Prosecutors believe Nathan deliberately scuttled the boat, an opinion shared by the life insurance company, which refused to pay out on his mom's policy. Unfortunately, though, Nathan will never see justice. He was found dead in his jail cell in June of 2023 while awaiting trial. According to officials, he was discovered unresponsive during the early morning hours at 2:30 a.m. An autopsy ruled that the death wasn't suspicious, but authorities have declined to reveal the exact cause of death. Nathan left behind a note for his lawyers, but its contents haven't been revealed. His most recent attorney, Martin J. Manella, told the New York Times that he had no idea things were going to take such a dark turn. He said that he'd been looking forward to letting the truth be known about his client. Number 1. Carl Carlson. A family in Murphys, California, started the 1991 New Year with a house fire that destroyed everything they owned and killed their matriarch. Carl Carlson managed to get the family's 3 children out safely, but he was unable to save his wife, Christina, who died in the blaze. An autopsy concluded that she died from smoke inhalation. And based on the results, it was impossible to tell whether foul play was involved. The scene was questionable, but not highly suspicious. First responders smelled kerosene, which Carl said the family used to heat their home. A container of it had spilled into the carpet recently, leaving a lingering odor. Firefighters wondered why a bathroom window was boarded up, but Carl said that he couldn't afford to fix it at the time. While these explanations didn't completely eliminate suspicion, investigators conceded that the fire could have been accidental. The very next day, Carl packed up the kids and moved across the country to his hometown in Seneca County, New York. When he didn't bother staying for Christina's services, it put her family on high alert. They worked tirelessly to try gathering enough evidence to convince law enforcement to consider the possibility of a homicide, but her death was ultimately ruled an accident. This meant that Carl could collect the $215,000 life insurance payout he was waiting for. 17 years later, in November 2008, Carl and Christina's 23-year-old son Levi was crushed to death by a pickup truck he was working on in the family's barn. It appeared as though the vehicle had fallen off a jack hours earlier, leaving Levi helplessly pinned to the ground. A medical examiner initially classified the death as accidental, enabling Carl to collect on the young man's $700,000 life insurance policy he took out shortly before his son's death. When Christina's family caught wind of the tragedy, their first thought was that Carl had gotten away with murder. Again, his estranged second wife, Cindy, told investigators that Carl and Levi had a fractured relationship. But shortly before Levi's death, it appeared as though they were trying to work on things. Carl had persuaded Levi to take out the hefty life insurance policy, and he also took one out on Cindy, causing her to fear that she'd be the next to go. This time, there was enough evidence to charge Carl. He was convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Meanwhile, the state of California found new evidence enabling prosecutors to try Carl for Christina's death as well. In Christina's case, he was convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. So luckily, he'll never step outside a prison again. If you made a mistake at your job that you were worried you'd get fired for, would you lie and say one of your co-workers was responsible, or would you own up to the mistake and take whatever punishment is necessary? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.